section 2. And the title of this is The Reign of Louis the 14th. So we'll be talking about Louis the 14th, monarch of France, considered one of the most powerful monarchs of his time. He liked to think of himself as the Sun King. And so background. The French throne in 1589 was held by a man named Henry of Navarre. He was a Catholic ruler. France had been a Catholic country ever since Clovis, king of the Franks, converted to Christianity. And so from that time forward, France was one of these bastions of the Catholic Church. Though he did issue a decree, the Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes was a particularly important decision made that religious toleration would be practiced in France. So meanwhile, most of the French people are Catholic, but because of the Edict of Nantes, it became safe to be a Huguenot, a Calvinist, a Lutheran, a Puritan, or what have you. During this time, Cardinal Richelieu, who was the minister of Louis VIII, who ruled France. Cardinal Richelieu was an incredibly powerful, and you could even argue manipulative minister. So kind of like what we were talking about, how much power did this person actually have? In fact, I believe it was Alexander Dumas who wrote the book The Three Musketeers. And he played on this idea a lot, that Richelieu had kind of the real power behind the throne. Well, anyway, Richelieu and King Henry of Navarre worked to limit the power of the nobility to increase power for themselves. So this was always the constant power struggle that these kings went through. To unify their country, they had to take a greater degree of control over the nobles. The nobles were the ones, the little, lords with castles who maintained the feudal system, who held great tracts of land. But again, the king would usually try to suppress those powers to maintain a nation state. Some important cultural attitudes that we need to talk about. One of these is the idea of skepticism. Western Europeans were becoming increasingly skeptical. For example, the Catholic Church had launched 4 unsuccessful crusades, each time promising that God willed them to take the Holy Land, and each were failures. The bubonic plague killed more of the clergy than it did anyone else. You've got cases where there were 2 popes excommunicating each other. You've got these disagreements like the iconoclast controversy. There's just a lot of reasons people were becoming increasingly skeptical about the Catholic Church. Martin Luther had some legitimate concerns when he brought up the problems of indulgences. And so more and more people were becoming skeptical and beginning to question things for themselves. And so we've got a couple of significant philosophers here. First is Montaigne. Montaigne began to write essays exploring, the essence of how do you define meaning in life. You could even say, he's one of the first existentialist philosophers. That a person can choose their own path and meaning in life, and that it does not have to be defined by the Catholic Church. Another of these important philosophers, René Descartes, began to use observation and reason, and even you could argue it a method to create a new philosophy. So Descartes was one famous for saying, "I think, therefore I am." Of course, that's something you hear. It's a cliche that we hear often, but what does it really mean? It means that if you're going to discover the truth of something, you first have to acknowledge that you know nothing. Take that as a baseline, and then be willing to learn. So if you're going to test a hypothesis, you have to go into that with the understanding that your preconceived beliefs may be wrong. If you're actually going to learn something, you have to be willing to admit that what you knew before may be wrong. And so Descartes formalized that with the statement, I think, therefore I am. Is the most powerful monarch in French history. He assumed control in 1661, and he immediately set up a nationwide system of tax collection through intendants. These are government agents that he sent out to collect taxes on behalf of the crown. So the previous systems had often relied on a balance of power between the nobility and the king, where the nobles would collect taxes and then they would pay them to the king. But Louis circumvented this process by directly collecting taxes from the French people.
The exploration of the Mississippi River by France that began in 1672 led the French explorers to claim a huge area in the center of North America for their king, Louis XIV. King Louis was what historians call an absolute monarch, meaning that he personally held all of the political power in France. He ruled as he saw fit, and he did as he pleased. King Louis was also extremely fond of both money and luxury. And it was in the early 1660s that he began construction of his new royal palace of Versailles, seen here. Versailles was destined to become the largest and most lavish palace in Europe. It was to serve both as his home and as the headquarters of the French government. And it was while Versailles was still being built that King Louis XIV decided to make New France, or Canada, which was the largest French colony in North America, a royal colony, in order to bring it much more firmly under his control. In particular, the king wanted New France to grow more rapidly, because at that time, its population was still very small compared to that of the rival English colonies just to the south. So in 1666, King Louis XIV commanded that an additional 2,500 French citizens be sent to settle there.
Sun King. So the Sun King here is pictured. And kind of like the painting that we looked at previously of King Philip II, he wants to be seen as divinely chosen. He's wearing extravagant clothing. Just look at his shoes, for example. Like, come on. Like, this guy is dressed to the nines. And he wanted to be seen as, the most attractive person in all of France, the most powerful figure. His image was plastered everywhere. There's a couple of advantages to having an absolute monarch. For one, King Louis XIV had absolute power over the economy, and his financial minister was able to stimulate economic growth by ruling absolutely. You can actually get things done in a very efficient manner if you just have one person saying, you do this, you do this, you do this. But again, like some of you also mentioned, one of the concerns of an absolute ruler is the threat of their whims. What happens if their mood changes? Where King Henry issued the Edict of Nantes saying, okay, we're going to be a religiously tolerant country. Okay, you can be skeptical, you can be a Protestant, doesn't matter what you believe. Louis canceled that. And said it is no longer safe for you to be a Huguenot or a Protestant or a skeptic. You must leave. You must all be Catholic. It's called the Palace at Versailles. And it is one of the fanciest palaces in all of Europe. It was so expensive to build that in addition to the constant wars that he was engaged in to expand territory, the palace and the wars bankrupted the French economy. Just absolute life of luxury that King Louis lived. Every meal was a feast. The nobles, in fact, were invited to live at Versailles, and to be honest, they were required to live there. And that was just another way that he kept the nobles under his thumb. Every meal was a feast. Again, this is just the lap of luxury. And the problem with this is so many of the French people were desperately poor. And okay, so you've seen the palace at Versailles. Versailles wasn't just the king's residence. It's the functioning house of the government. It's where the nobles lived. It's where laws were made. It's where artists were invited to stay and to live and to make music and to create works of art. And the purpose of these were all to glorify the king. Everything in Louis XIV's France was about Louis XIV, including wars. He fought a series of wars through the 1660s and 1670s to expand his territories. In fact, he was just a constant threat to other Western European states that many began to unite against him. And this constant warfare was a drain on the French economy. It led to high taxes. It led to often weak harvests because farmers were called upon to leave their farms and go fight in these wars. And, for example, when the War of the Spanish Succession began in 1701, this was began in an attempt to prevent the union of the French and Spanish thrones. And so this came to an end in 1714, where France and Spain actually both came out as losers in this. Really left a mixed legacy. For one, France was the major military and cultural power in Europe. But of course, the downside is that these constant wars and huge military left them with heavy debts. In fact, it won't be long now until France's economy will collapse, resulting in the French Revolution, and King Louis XVI will get his head cut off by the French people. And so while Louis XIV set up a life of opulence and built France into a powerful state, its success was hollow because they couldn't afford all of these things that they were doing. The debt of the royal treasury throughout the life of Louis XIV. In fact, by the end of his reign, the French family, the royal family, was in a really tough situation. And to pay this increasing national debt, the French people are going to have to continue to pay higher and higher taxes.